Good evening and welcome. I'm Vic Marks, and tonight we continue with the fourth week of 10 questions, if not now, when? I welcome you, students of the 10 questions course, and I welcome you, our extended community. 10 questions was conceived to bring extraordinary makers and thinkers from across the university and beyond together. With 10 questions, the arts are an engine for discovery. And each week, students study the work of our guest artists and create projects in response to the weekly question. This week, students will be having conversations with their ancestors. As we look back and also continue forward, I'd like to recall where 10 questions has been so far this fall. There's a story accumulating here. It began with, who are we? With the we in air quotes, so that we could attend to the dangers and also the possibilities inherent in we. In our second week, the question was, how do we begin? As in, how do we begin again? Or where to from here? And last week, those gathered with us asked, how do we connect? For the students, our graduate teaching assistants, Triwi Harjito and Anne Hay Young, and myself, our big takeaways from last week were networks. Life grows in networks, in yeast, in neural functioning, and of course, in the ubiquitous internet. How else do we connect? Well, vulnerability is a powerful access point to connection. And the theater, a place where we tell our stories, is a vital resource for connecting beyond our everyday experience. Luis Alfaro left us with the question, when you look at me, what about me do you not see? Tonight, we consider the question, how do we remember? George Santayana, a philosopher in the first half of the 20th century, gave us the aphorism, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I'd like to ask for your participation now. If you feel comfortable doing so, please share with us in the chat. Do you want to honor, to actively remember? This could be a personal memory or a public collective one. Take a moment and share that in the chat. What person or event do you want to honor, to actively remember? This can be a personal memory or something that many of us share. I know one of the problems with the chat in doing this is that it happens quickly. But thank you, I'm seeing them coming in, and by your writing it here in some way, we all can hold those memories with you. Coming to terms with our past offers the possibility of not repeating it. This reminds me of our question, how do we begin again? We're living in a country shaped by colonization, enslavement, and racialized capitalism. To keep these systems fueling a global economy where profit motives trump sustainability and care for others, selective remembering is crucial. So, what version of the past, which stories are remembered? And on the other hand, which stories are suppressed? What's forgotten? We, the whole of humanity, we do not remember the same. Here's an example. I went to a very white elementary school in the 1960s. At that time, I learned nothing of the genocide of Indigenous Americans. I learned nothing about the capture and enslavement of Black people. I learned nothing about workers' solidarity movements. I learned about the founding fathers and the brave settlers. I learned on no uncertain terms that America was great. These lessons set a template for a world I thought I knew. Now, I believe that the stories that get repeated about the past encircle us, sometimes invisibly, sometimes relentlessly and painfully. These stories, whatever they are, impact belief, inform imagination, and culminate in action. For me, I ultimately came to realize that these stories limited the possibilities inherent in the world in which I wanted to live. Today, hopefully now with some transformative distance from my elementary school education, I understand that how we conduct our lives is built upon the foundational stories we hold close. And that is why Texas's current critical race theory bill determining what can and can't be taught in social studies is particularly alarming. There's a lot that will be left out, and a new generation of children will not have a complete set of stories with which to connect to their past in order to form the future. This evening will include a 10-minute presentation from our three guests who will each bring a particular perspective to the project of remembering. This will be followed once again by a very special sharing made by the multi-generational after-school arts program. The acronym is MASA, based at the UCLA Community School in Koreatown. We will follow this with a conversation amongst our guests, and we'll conclude with your questions, which you may submit in the chat or by using the Q&A feature. When we reach the end of our program at or near 8:30 p.m. Pacific time, we'll say good evening to you all. And now, our first guest tonight is Angela Riley. Angela, who is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, is professor at UCLA School of Law and director of UCLA's Native Nations Law and Policy Center. She directs the JD-MA Joint Degree Program in Law and American Indian Studies and serves on the UCLA Campus Repatriation Committee. Professor Riley's research focuses on Indigenous peoples' rights with an emphasis on cultural property and Native governance. In 2003, she was selected to serve on her tribe's Supreme Court, becoming the first woman and youngest justice of the Supreme Court of the citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. In 2010 and 2016, she was elected by her tribe's general council to serve as Chief Justice. She previously served as co-chair for the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Partnership Policy Board with a dedicated mission to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you very much. Bojo Jayek, Angela Riley, Nadejdikas, Shishibani, Potawatomi Andao. Hi everyone, my name is Angela Riley. I'm from the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully that works. You can see. Great. So I wanted to just start off my brief remarks tonight by saying a little bit about where I'm from and how I remember. The photo that you're seeing right now is a picture looking north at the homestead where I was raised in rural Oklahoma, just near Saddle Mountain in Kiowa County, Oklahoma. If you're looking toward the family homestead there, Saddle Mountain is behind us, and Rainy Mountain is off to the west, and the family farm is off to the east. So I wanted to just show you a few photos tonight and talk a little bit about what I think of when I talk about remembering and what that means for me. For me, thinking about remembering is to talk about what happened at the beginning and to really start at the beginning. And In my experience as a tribal member and as a scholar of Indian law and an Indigenous person, I find that in the United States, as Vic commented in her opening remarks, many people aren't really aware in the United States of what happened at the beginning and who was here at the beginning and where we really are. And so I wanted to show you a few photos. The photo I'm showing you right now is, as you'll see, is a couple of maps, one which of course depicts the United States and Canada and Mexico, and also then represents this as Turtle Island, which is how this place is referred to by many Indigenous peoples who call it home, who've been here since time immemorial. So when I think about how we remember, I think about the beginning and what it means for tribes to have pre-existed the formation of the United States, for us to be pre-constitutional sovereign bodies. This is a photograph of the Tworow Wampum. This is one of the very first treaties that was entered into between Indigenous nations and foreign powers. This is of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which marks the relationship, the symbiotic relationship and equal power dynamic of the sovereigns of the Haudenosaunee peoples, which of course many people know today as the Iroquois Confederacy, and foreign powers in some of the earliest pictorial formations of the relationship between colonizers and Indigenous nations. So when you look at this, this slide, there are a few kind of key features that I point out here. One is that to understand that Indian nations are pre-constitutional. That means that tribes today in the United States, of which there are hundreds, have sovereignty that pre-exists the formation of the United States. The United States, initially the colonial powers, and the United States eventually treated with Indian nations as sovereign powers. We entered into more than 300 treaties between the United States and the Indian nations, and this is developed as a sovereign to sovereign relationship, which I'll say a little bit more about in a few minutes. But I wanted to particularly turn to where we are right now. I want to just note that I am in Los Angeles, which means I am on the traditional and unceded land of the Tongva peoples. This is Indian land. Wherever you are in the United States, where you're watching this, you are on Indian land. You are on the land of some Indigenous nation that pre-existed your presence there. This is actually a map that was commissioned and done by the incredible artist River Garza to depict some of the areas that we're currently in, if you're in the Los Angeles area near UCLA, that demonstrate the home of the Tongva peoples. And you can see here, of course, that UCLA is marked on this map. This is really the product of incredible artwork, but also collaboration and engagement with the Tongva community to more accurately represent actually what is, who was originally home in Los Angeles and who is still here. And I think one of the mistakes that gets made when people do begin to finally engage with and learn about Indigenous issues is to make the mistake of thinking that Indigenous peoples are in the past somehow, that it's a long history ago and somehow Indigenous peoples no longer exist. But of course, those of us who work in this area and whose lives are touched by this know that is not the case. I want to just show you a few more pictures that give you kind of an idea of what it is to talk about Indian country and what it is to say that this is Indian land. This is a relatively, it's very small, so I apologize, you might not be able to see all the writing, but you can at least see the color coding on this map, which is a map of the United States that gives you some indication of where Indian country, which is a term of art under federal law, where Indian country is in the United States. You can of course see that there's a great deal of Indian country in what is now the state of Oklahoma, all through the northern and southern plains, and particularly concentrated in the Southwest and through the western part of the United States. Despite efforts to eradicate and remove and confine Indians to reservations, and eventually to assimilate and oversee the demise of Indian people, we know that that didn't happen, although there were great efforts toward that end. Currently, there are 574 federally recognized Indian tribes in the US and Native Alaskan villages. We are around 1% of the US population, and we control around 70 million acres in the lower 48. Land, of course, was one of the driving forces of trying to essentially eradicate the Indian presence in North America and in the United States in order to make room for white settlement. This is an actual bill promoting the settlement of Indian lands and the breaking up of the reservations. I bring this up in particular for one reason. It's had enormous impact in the United States and also enormous impact for my own home state of Oklahoma and for many, many tribes in the state of Oklahoma, which is that when the reservations were opened up, the state of Oklahoma encroached on Indian country and continued to assert its own jurisdiction on the reservations of many of the tribes there, including those of the original 5 tribes. Despite Oklahoma doing so for over 100 years, the Supreme Court ruled in 2020 in a case called Oklahoma versus McGirt that in fact we do have to remember. And the way that we remember is to acknowledge and recognize that only Congress can abrogate a treaty with an Indian tribe, and only Congress can abrogate a reservation. A state cannot do it, even by encroaching on a tribe. So what happened in that case just a couple of years ago is the Supreme Court ruled in a very closely decided 5-4 decision that the reservation of the Muskogee Creek Nation was never disestablished by the state of Oklahoma or otherwise. And therefore, if you take a look at the photo or the map that I have now, if you look at that purple line, what this essentially means is that the Creek Nation, along with the other 4 of the 5 original tribes in Oklahoma, all maintain their reservations, which means they're now asserting an enormous amount of sovereignty and jurisdiction over a great part of what is now the state of Oklahoma. This has a much more complicated legal history and many, many more legal nuances that I won't go into. But all of this is to say that as we sort of take up the question of how do we remember, it's such a critical part of the question to see the first line of Justice Gorsuch's opinion is, on the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. This is a way of saying we do remember and we must remember, and we must acknowledge and understand whose land we are on. This has resonance for my own tribe, which is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. We are located in the state of Oklahoma, and we are known as the people of the place of the fire because we were in a confederacy where we actually held the fire for our other tribes to come back to at the end of the night, at the end of war. I want to just show a couple of more slides and conclude. I don't want to speak over my time, but I did just want to emphasize a couple of things that I think many people who aren't familiar with Indigenous rights may not be aware of. And I think a big part of remembering Native people is to understand that we are still here. We are here today. There are 574 Indian nations in the US that are federally recognized, many more that are unrecognized, including here in the state of California. We have our own governments, our own constitutions, our own police forces, our own courts, our own languages. We do maintain sovereignty over our territory and our people. And this is true on reservations and in Indian country all across the United States. What I see happening in the future and what I think about when I think about how we remember is to sort of think about what we take from the past and how it leads us into tomorrow. For me, that's really a recognition of 2 really critical things. One is the United States obligation to uphold its the treaty rights of Native nations and the treaty obligations that it made with the Indian tribes. What you see here, I have 2 photos. The one on the left is a photograph of the American flag flying over the Cannonball River on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in September of 2016. I took this photo myself with an iPhone when I was there for the Standing Rock protest in order to attempt to prevent the construction of the DAPL pipeline. The other photo is a photo of the cover of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the most ambitious and capacious statement of the rights of Indigenous peoples ever in the history of the world. It passed the UN General Assembly in 2007 with an overwhelming vote in favor. Only 4 countries in the world voted against the UN Declaration at that time. They were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. All 4 of those countries have since changed their votes in favor of the declaration, with the United States being the last country in the world to express its support for the declaration in the Obama administration in 2010. So for me, remembering is grabbing onto those things of the past, treaty rights and those obligations, and then looking toward the future and thinking about a human rights framework for Indigenous rights as we move forward in an incredibly complex world, but in a world that can greatly benefit from the lessons of indigeneity, particularly as we strive as people to live on this planet in a sustainable way, in concert with other living beings, not just other humans, but all living things, and to think about the pressures of saving our planet and the pressures of climate change. With that, I will close with my final slide. This is a photograph of Saddle Mountain right behind the farm where I was raised. This is at the Kiowa-Comanche County line. This is the site of what was formerly the Kiowa-Comanche Apache Reservation. Like I said, it's the farm where I was raised and my family's lived for many, many, many generations. I wanted to close with just giving you a Potawatomi phrase in closing of Jaginaganon. Jaginaganon in Potawatomi means all my relations. And it really stands for exactly what that expresses, that we are all related. In fact, all living things on the planet are related, and we are all relatives here. And so as my relatives, I thank you for being here tonight and for listening to my words. And I look forward to engaging in conversation with all of you later. So Shimegwech, thank you.
Angela, thank you so much. All our relations. I like that. And I appreciate that picture at the end because it reminds me we are talking about real places, not the drawn and graphic maps that we so often see. Thank you for sharing home. And I also feel as somebody who is thinking about how to enliven land acknowledgements, feeling that just seeing that map of the Tongva of Tobinar really helps to take the land acknowledgement a whole step further, everywhere, all the land. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our second guest this evening, Anurima Banerji, who's my colleague from the Department of World Arts and Culture's Dance. Anurima Banerji is Associate Professor and current Graduate Vice Chair in the Department of World Arts and Culture's Dance. As a scholar, poet, and trained Odissi dancer, Banerji shares the faculty's goal of bridging the worlds of academia and art. Her research principally concerns critical historicizations of Indian dance and its relationship to the state. Banerji's work is informed by an intersectional and interdisciplinary approach based on the insights of post-colonialism, critical race theory, performance studies, feminist and queer philosophy, and discourses of class, regionalism, and religion in India. Anurima Banerji is affiliated with the UCLA Center for India and South Asia, the Center for Performance Studies, the Center for the Study of Women, and the LGBTQ Studies Program, and serves on the nominations committee at the Dance Studies Association. A warm welcome, Anurima.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm very honored to be here with my colleagues, Leroy Moore and Angela Riley. And I want to thank you, Vic and Anne-Marie, for organizing this gathering. So my remarks today address the question of how we remember from the perspective of dance and performance studies. So in these disciplines, we place an emphasis on the knowledge produced and carried by the body, and consider the social meanings and political effects of these physical practices. Dance and performance are important because they challenge the prevailing Cartesian bias in the West, or the dominant understandings of reason and cognitive activities as partitioned from and somehow superior to somatic practices and kinetic intelligence. So even though remembering may be understood conventionally as a mental process, the act of reminiscence and mediating the past occurs not only in the cognitive realm, but also through bodily means and practices such as dance. As Paul Connerton notes in his wonderful book, How Societies Remember, quote, our bodies, which in commemorations stylistically reenact an image of the past, keep the past also in an entirely effective form in their continuing ability to perform certain skilled actions. In habitual memory, the past is, as it were, sedimented in the body, unquote. So dance, especially classical dance, which emphasizes the repetition of established bodily techniques and repertoire in the name of propagating tradition, can be understood as a form of such acquired habitual memory, intentionally integrated through artistic training, that is sedimented in the body, keeping the past alive and vibrant in the present. In this sense, classical dance becomes a way of invoking, accumulating, and articulating resonances and recollections of the past in a contemporary body. So the classical is a way of keeping the past, but it's also a way of inventing the past. The work of creating a canonical tradition through deliberate acts of selection and forgetting is central to the social and political work of collective remembrance. In creating an imagined lineage and continuity between the ancient world and modern society, the classical offers a kind of cultural capital that projects an idealized view of a given community's past. It's a label that grants a nobility to its aesthetic production, and which apparently represents the culture's most meritorious aesthetic achievements. The people who compose the society in question can be celebrated for creating the conditions of possibility for the grandeur of the classical masterpiece to emerge, so that the classical belongs not just to an individual creator, but to the populace at large that contributes and makes a cultural ethos and ambience that allows it to take shape. Symbolically, then, the classical represents the sophistication and refinement of the society from which it is said to emanate. And beyond that, it embodies the potential of art to reach across the limited spans of time and space into a more transcendent sphere, where it can be appreciated even as a global heritage. Yet often the frictive context, and more pointedly, a discussion of the power relations, social hierarchies, and standards that inform the making of the classical, the violence of erasure and suppression that underlies it, tend to be effaced in many of the prevailing discussions. The classical often appears as a self-evident category of artistic merit today and has a global currency, whether we think about music or literature, sculpture or architecture, painting or dance. The classical adjective operates as a shorthand to describe a certain set of distinguished aesthetic forms and values that are present in a given artwork. Yet the classical genre, like many others, deserves close critical attention. Why has the classical become an established term that is so commonly used in cultural discourse? Why does this aesthetic category exist? And how did it come into being? Why is there such a strong communitarian investment in the classical concept? What are we remembering through it? Is the concept of the classical valid at all? These are some of the questions guiding my current research on Indian classical dance. I draw from that research now to talk about how the classical, in this case classical dance, becomes a way that a society chooses to remember its past, and how societies often also actively construct the classical, even when it doesn't actually exist as a concept in an indigenous imaginary. Given again the currency of classicism in global art discourse and the global marketplace, and the need, the classical fulfills this need to control historical narratives about the beginning, about the origins, about the past through cultural representation. So the deployment of classical ideals in post-colonial societies especially can be used to negotiate the legacies of colonialism, the ongoing dynamics of cultural imperialism, as well as for managing internal social identity-based differences. The case of Indian classical dance offers a rich ground for examining this phenomenon of inventing a category to claim cultural parity with Western classicism, which is itself a category also invented, also fragile and fraught, also subject to critical scrutiny. So classical dance is a significant trope and emblem of identity for the contemporary Indian state, its subjects, and its diasporas, and circulates globally as an established aesthetic idiom. In my research, I examine how the category of classical dance was invented in India and also explore the performative value of the concept. That is what the idea of classical dance does, how it's deployed, the politics of its production. I argue that Indian classical dance has no real ontological status or substance, and contend it was produced entirely by the nexus of colonial and native elites, along with Orientalist scholars in the modern period, for the purposes of mobilizing Indian heritage politics and attempting to establish equivalence between Western and Indian art practices on Western terms. In historicizing how Indian classical dance emerged as an aesthetic genre, my initial findings have indicated that the classical idea was discursively constituted under the British colonial regime in the 18th century. First, interestingly, in the legal domain. Classical laws were developed with the aim of ruling the native population in India by codifying and centralizing legal principles drawn from eminent Indian and British sources. After its introduction into the world of law, the classical idea proliferated in the space of the performing arts, as well as other art practices, classical music, literature, visual art, philosophy, and architecture, theater, successively came into being. Indian classical dance first emerged as a definite label in the 1920s, even as certain forms were regulated and banned by the same colonial authorities working with Indian social reformers, so that traditional forms, like the one you're watching, Odissi, became stigmatized. Later, however, these dance styles were recuperated and officially authorized by the Indian government in the wake of India's independence in 1947. So the 4 types of dance that were endorsed by the state, which was quite unusual and still is, that a state would endorse certain kinds of dance practices. These 4 types in India are the classical, the folk, the tribal, and the creative, which was later changed to contemporary. 8 dance forms drawn from all over India constitute the classical canon today: Bharatnatyam, Manipuri, Kathakali, Kuchipudi, Kathak, Satriya, Mohiniyattam, and Odissi, which you're seeing on the screen. Classical dance enjoys a privileged status as a sign of high art, with performers in this space regarded as consummate cultural ambassadors for India's abiding artistic legacies on both the domestic and international stage. Classical dances are typically framed as ancient practices with an ageless quality, linked largely to Hindu religious values and described as a way of expressing devotion to divine power, or a more generalized sense of spirituality. The example you're seeing here is traditional Odissi by its most skilled and celebrated exponent today, Guru Sujata Mohapatra. So the classical is typically invoked as representative of what is best in a culture, its hallmarks of aesthetic excellence, serving as a repository for a culture's most cherished and idealized values, indicating that which endures over time as well as across space. But I wonder in my research, does the classical in India even exist, as I was saying? So my argument is that there is no such thing as this category from a discursive perspective, because each term in that seemingly stable phrase can be critically interrogated to reveal its contingencies. And beyond that, more importantly, there is no actual framework for the classical in the Indian aesthetic realm, historically and culturally speaking. So I suggest that the phrase Indian classical dance is a misleading misnomer, given that it's not pan-Indian, but regional and transnational in character, not dance, but interdisciplinary performance that brings together theatricality and music with movement, and not classical, because what you're seeing here in a classical practice is actually a conflation of ritual, folk, court, concert, and popular forms. The classical originally served as a category designed to exalt the achievements and heritage of European civilization, granting it antiquity by establishing a link to ancient Greece and Rome. Imported into the colonies, the idea of the classical was further amplified as it presented a teleological model of comparison that inevitably highlighted Western aesthetics as the standard and apex of cultural accomplishment. Modern European and Indian notions of the classical today overlap in their concerns with reviving their respective ties to ancient, purportedly ancient civilizations, presenting dance as an edifying practice, and treating dance as a special medium that involves systematized study, physical refinement, and rigor, where the cultivated body represents both aesthetic excellence and the ability to command oneself, govern oneself. So the general ideological associations of the classical as the most sophisticated form of cultural expression, as evidence of superlative civilizational achievement, are shared across the Western and Indian contexts. But they are dissimilar in that Indian classical traditions tend to favor narratives of unbroken continuity with ancient lineages, and also tend to be idealized as expressions of Hindu devotion in particular. This is because the classical era in India is identified with a time in history marked by the predominance of Hindu influences. In much, especially of the dominant conservative historiography of the ancient period from 1500 BC into the 5th century CE, this is the purported golden age, unsullied by future forces of cultural and moral degradation. In contrast, Western classical norms arguably prize aesthetic virtuosity above all and allude to ancient values rather than claiming pure continuity with them, and they disavow, at least publicly, the role of religiosity, which at one point was central to their formation. Classical dance in India, then, is a contradictory practice. It serves as an idealized form of remembering pristine ancient glories and mostly Hindu tradition, continually renewing them in the present, in the persistent form of the dancing body, while excising the messy frictions of history as it reclaims a mythical past uncontaminated by historical vagaries, centering Hindu narratives to the virtual exclusion of others. And this matters in a multi-faith society. Yet classical dance also functions in a contradictory sense as a complex decolonial practice, containing within it the memory of that which has survived colonial oppression, restoring to a place of value what was once disparaged by outside forces as well as native elites. And so this aesthetic category continues to function in some ways as a form of post-colonial resistance to the Eurocentric norm of classicism as the presumed property of the West, and as an index of remembering the rich heritage of performing arts in the subcontinent, defying the imperialist trope of the colonized as uncivilized. Yet we should also recall that the classical in India has no substantive history in the Indian context. It is a discourse, an imported modern imperialist English language invention in the aesthetic milieu, and I propose we should do away with it on these grounds. There is no need to invest in the hierarchized cultural system denoted by the classical valuation anywhere, to monumentalize and singularize history through it. When various versions of the past are constantly palpable in present day India as elsewhere, in all of their shades and multiplicities. For how we remember through the aesthetics of the classical is deeply and unavoidably political.
Well, I so appreciate just at the very get-go that memory is housed in the body, and that these dances that we might look at, I'm saying this in a really beginner level, these dances that we might look at are containers of not only some notion of history, but contested histories, multiple histories, the desires of a society at a moment in time. And yet we look at it as a classical Indian dance. Is so rich to pull apart. And I feel like you're looking at this, at dance, and asking us to think about the ways in which it holds history, politics, power. Am I there with you, Anurima?
Absolutely. And I just find it really interesting what we choose to foreground in terms of how we remember and what we remember. And of course, this is a question. That's why this question for this week is so rich, because it pertains so much to the ways in which history has become a battleground, not only in India, but also here. And many of the same debates are happening around belonging. And these questions are often mediated through our aesthetic categories, like classicism in particular. So I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, and I'm, both in your presentation and Angela's, this notion that we have to pull together artifacts, like sort of like archaeologists of our history, of these different histories, but they're there. We have to look for them. Thank you, and we'll continue this conversation and discussion momentarily, but I'd like to move on, and I'm delighted to welcome our third guest this evening, Leroy Moore. Leroy Moore is a Black disabled poet, author, and activist on issues of race and disability. He's co-founder of Crip Hop Nation, a worldwide association of artists with disabilities, as well as the National Black Disability Coalition and the performance art collective Sins Invalid. Born in 1967 with cerebral palsy in New York City, Moore has traveled internationally, networking with other disabled activists and artists, and organized a Bay Area tour of African disabled musicians. His work includes documentary film, spoken word CDs, poetry books, a children's book, and his most recent, Black Disabled Ancestors. He is currently a doctoral student in linguistic anthropology at UCLA. Welcome, Leroy.
Remember the book, Black Disabled Art History 101. Now it's time for a music video. If you don't know, now you know. Time to stop, correct the wrong, then continue honoring. Forcing oral communication, oralism. Alexander Graham Bell, what would you say to the fathers of hip hop? Today's music video by Sign Mark, Soul Rock, and Wawa, You Can't Stop. We picked our own leaders, like Andrew Jackson Foster. Your time has passed. Read our sign language. Cast one talked about the dozens on slave ships. Ain't that some shit? They all had disabilities. The godfathers of hip hop. Coming off those boats, we followed the drinking gorge. Peg Leg Joe, holding Harriet Tubman in the middle of a seizure. Underground Railroad leading to blues trails. Josh White Sr. leading blind blues artists throughout the South. Meet an elder, a disabled black man, Jim Crow, just dancing in his neighborhood. with the white man looking on. Things were not good. Took his clothes, learned his songs and dance to put on minstrel shows. Open up cages. We are not freaks. Freedom to William Henry Johnson. That haunting moaning from Blind Willie Johnson. Chick Webb providing the drum beat. Can't forget Big Boss Lady. Her blues still whips around with Chicago wind singing I'm a lot of. Hey people, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me, the host, and thanks for all the tech and all the people that's in the room. So first I want to describe myself. I'm a Black man with a bald head, and I have a Black UCLA jacket on. I'm in my kitchen, and so that's me. And my full name is Leroy Moore Jr. And I want to start with, what do I do? Because I do a lot. I'm a poet, I'm a hip hop founder, I'm a storyteller, and now I'm back as a student. But this has been only a month and a half being back in school, being a PhD student, and I hear students talk about my research. This is my research. This is the people I'm studying. I talk about this is my life because my quote unquote research is my life. It's a huge amount of other people's lives being Black and disabled. So that's how I represent my quote unquote studies. It's my life. And I want to see what I do to be a build on to my Black disabled ancestors. So that little poem in the beginning is going to be a music song. It's called Ironing. And it's ironing Black disabled ancestors from slave ships to freak shows to jazz, all the way up to hip hop. But to get there, you have to really reshape what you think around disability. Because now people think of disability as, only getting services and that's it. But I'm thinking, and I know that my disability is like my race. It's a part of me, my culture, my history. So we have to flip that thinking around disability. And the way I want to flip it for you, so I want to take you back. I want to take you back to the 1970s. And did you see that little baby picture? Isn't that a cute picture? Yeah, so that's little Leroy back in the 70s. I want to place you there in the 70s. And, a little bit older than my little picture, place you there. What do you do as a Black disabled little boy back then? Always searching for that mirror that looks like you. And that was my search back then. And I found it. I found it through my father's record collection. I found disabled Black blues singers. I was like, oh, snap, this is me. It's so important to see yourself. you don't see yourself, then you don't consider yourself, you know, a person or something that you could contribute to society. So when I saw those my father's record collection, and also what I saw back then was the opera Porgy and Bess. And some people don't know Porgy and Bess was a Black opera that dealt, and Porgy was the lead character, and Porgy had a disability. So I saw that on TV, changed my whole life. I yelled from the living room, "Mom, Mom, I'm on TV."
Mm.
My mom came out and looked like, "Oh, that's Porgy." And I looked at my mom, I was like, "I'm Porgy?" Because I saw myself on TV. And then those two experiences, my father's record collection and Porgy, formed a foundation in me. And I'm still on that trail today as a PhD student, trying to find my Black disabled people in the world, ancestors, living dancers, hip hop artists, trying to find them so we can connect. You know, we talk about remembering. How can you not remember? Especially being a person of color and being disabled. And after having this foundation that held me all these years, you know, through all the oppression, through teachers saying, "Oh, Leroy does not." I took my father's record collections to school. I was like, you know, "Can we listen to this?" They said, "No, we gotta listen to Beethoven." So, you know, constantly being oppressed by the system, by adults, that foundation gave me the means to go on because I knew it was there. And it grew at a time. When I read about Harriet Tubman and her disability, her seizures, and it just grew and grew and grew. And unfortunately, most of this growth and most of this education was outside the education institutions. You know, disability studies is new. You know, there's no disability studies in the 70s and 80s and, you know, early 90s. So you had to do those types of education, you know, outside of the education institutions. And most Black people had to do that, you know, anyway, you know, before Black studies. So, you know, I bring this up because it really affects the future. You know, we talk about remembering, and that is good, yes, remember, but what you're gonna leave in the future, and that's my life. You know, people call it a PhD. I call it my life. And what we're leaving in the future for Queerpop Nation. Though Queerpop Nation is an international network of musicians, artists, poets with disabilities from around the world. And we've been doing this for 15 years outside of the educational system on SSI dollars. You know, and so what we're doing right now is that we want to open up a Queer Pop Institute here in LA. This is gonna be my PhD dissertation. It's not gonna be a book, it's not gonna be a paper that they, you know, toss on the shelves. No, it's gonna be an institution where that little boy in the picture, that little Leroy, years down the line can go to an institution and see himself. He doesn't need to search all day outside of the institutions to see himself. He can go right up to the Queer Pop Institute right in LA and see the rich history of Black disabled people from slave boats to today. So that's the future that Queer Pop, myself, Keith Jones is trying to lead for our future generations coming out. I just leave you with you talk about remembering. I thought about Black disabled ancestors. I did this book called Black Disabled Ancestors a couple years ago under Poor Press. To check out Poor Press at poormagazine.org. They do kick-ass work. But this book, my ancestors for a whole year came to me and said, Leroy, you need to do this book. And they would not let me sleep until I did the book. And the book has about 6 stories of 2 Black disabled ancestors, each coming back in each story and telling about their lives back then and telling what should happen now. So, for example, the first story is Porgy, because Porgy has always been with me since I was a little kid, since I saw it on TV. And Jim Crow. A lot of people don't know that Jim Crow is a real person. People think that Jim Crow was, segregation and, blacks over here and whites over here. But he was a real elderly, disabled man. And he was dancing in his neighborhood, like I said in the poem. And a white Jewish man came to his neighborhood and say, "Oh, can I learn your dance?" Took his dance, took his clothes, and went to and made minstrel shows. But I picked these 2 characters for the first story to come back because they're 2 Black disabled men. They almost had the same story of their identity being stolen from them. So they come back and they talk about their lives, but they also talk about, queer pop and how today's society should see Black disabled men and how we should come together. So, I leave you with that story because, we talk about remembering, and those are our disabled ancestors. So we can't leave those stories undone. And a lot of Black and people of color with disabled ancestors, their stories are not completed because they didn't enjoy what we enjoy today. We had disability studies, we had disability justice, we had disability rights. Back then, there was no disability studies or disability rights. So we have to go back and really complete those stories, do our research, talk to the ancestors, let the ancestors talk to you, and put these stories down. Because these stories can be and should be in schools, in high schools and grade schools. My book, Black Disabled Ancestors and Black Disabled History 101, should be in schools. And we're in California. And California has a law saying in high school, disability history and queer history should be taught. But unfortunately, a lot of times our laws are not enforced. Our laws are not enforced, and they don't have funding to enforce them. So we ourselves have to pick up this law in California and make these schools teach, this kind of history. Make these schools buy, the books of, Black disabled poets and artists that are coming out now that have books and books just waiting to be purchased from schools. So I leave you with that, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, Leroy, there's, this notion, how could we not remember? And the way I feel like what you're talking about is, and bringing to this evening, is a layer of urgency. How could there be a future at all without assembling your ancestors? And in some ways, it sounds like what you're doing with your writing is collapsing the past into the present, is sort of bringing it all together into now, and that's what we need to do. Does that sound right to you? And
Yes, indeed, yes.
And urgency, like now.
Yeah, right now. Yeah, you don't have time to waste.
I'm excited to learn more about your research that you do as you continue to live your life here at UCLA.
Thank you.
I'm going to make a shift now to, before we shift to a conversation amongst our guests, here's that special project that we promised earlier. The 10 Questions team has been collaborating with Kevin Kane, director of UCLA's Visual and Performing Arts Education Program, that becomes VAPA. And Kevin is dedicated to working throughout Los Angeles using the arts to bring students, families, and communities together. I'm delighted to introduce Kevin Kane.
Thank you, Vic. It's a pleasure to join you all once again and to introduce a very special program and project. The MASA program at the UCLA Community School, located in historic Koreatown, is VAPA's program. So it's a special pleasure to introduce this community to you all tonight. The program's name actually has two meanings. MASA as an acronym, multi-generational after-school arts program. These are weekly art sessions provided at a designated time for the participants to make art together as a family, at the same time building and nurturing family and community in a different context. And masa as in the key ingredient in many Latin American dishes like tortillas, pupusas, gorditas, and tamales. So masa, like art, is an essential ingredient to life, to family. And a great way to jump off for our prompt for the evening: how do we remember? For the MASA program, this question is not a hypothetical one or an intellectual exercise. It's a daily practice, and one that's highlighted every year at this time through the community's Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead events. A treasured, sacred Indigenous celebration, an opportunity to remember loved ones that we continue to keep alive in memory. Dia de los Muertos for the MASA program is an annual community and arts event that is anchored in family, steeped in cultural significance, comprising traditional art making and family customs that have been passed along for generations, mixed with other components that adapt and evolve with each passing year, with each new generation that reimagine and reconstruct the traditional. The ofrendas, or altars created for the event, hold cherished photos, meaningful possessions, favorite foods and drinks, fragrant flowers, candles, numerous pieces of handcrafted art and artifact. This year and last, the MASA program responded to the pandemic by having participants make individual cajitas, small symbolic boxes, handmade, unique, painted and decorated, each one in memory of a cherished loved one. Some were made at home together as a family. Others were created at the school site. Soon they'll all be collected, combined, and installed together as a full group altar on display to the entire school community. Together, they represent the vastness of remembering, of the love and lives that stay eternal in all of us, a light that forever burns bright, a loss that never quite erodes, a symbol of family and community and continuity. I'm thrilled to share a sneak preview of this year's Dia de los Muertos celebration from MASA. What an honor it is for all of us to witness their creativity and to receive their generosity. My gratitude to VAPA teaching artist Raimundo Baltasar and Berto Lule for helping the tremendous artists pull together their artworks, and our wonderful editor, Brian P., for making this video possible. As always, it's an enormous gratitude. It's with enormous gratitude and great respect for the MASA families and the entire UCLA community, school community, many of whom are with us here tonight in this room. So without further ado, let's see their video.
So we're getting started. Ya tenemos práctica, ¿verdad?
Mi nombre es María Luz Muñoz y esta cajita se la dedico a mis papás y a mi suegra.
Buenas tardes, Masa. Esta es mi caja y representa a gente de nuestra familia que perdimos en el pasado y recordándolos ahora otra vez, y todas las cruces blancas que vemos acá decidimos dejarlas como la gente que murió, que no tuvo oportunidad con COVID, que ni siquiera tienen un nombre en alguna lista.
Hey everyone. So this is my box that I did, my ofrenda, and I really did it just for a specific person, which is my godmother, whose name was Guadalupe Mendoza, who passed away last year.
My name is Amy Gomez. This is how I celebrate Dia de los Muertos.
So the reason I did this is because in 2020, a lot of Black lives have been lost due to police brutality. So I just wanted to remember all of the people that died.
Para nosotros es muy importante esta fecha, ya que es recordar a las personas que se fueron
Y amamos.
y amábamos y seguimos amando.
We may place some candles so that it lights their path.
Pusimos su comida favorita, tamales.
We gave them their favorite food, tamales.
Les pusimos agua para que sacien su sed.
We gave them water so that they don't go thirsty.
Y hay sal.
And there is some salt
Para purificar.
to purify.
¿Cómo la recuerdo? Esta ofrenda es en honor a mi madre, Esperanza. A mi madre Esperanza. ¿Cómo recuerdo a mi madre? Bueno, cada vez que yo veo flores, me recuerda a ella porque le gustaba mucho, pero especialmente las dalias era una de sus flores favoritas. Y esta ofrenda es en honor a ella.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Masa and Kevin and your whole team for sharing the Dios de los Muertos tradition of ofrendas with us. Such a beautiful way to gather family and to ensure that the spirits of departed loved ones stay with us. I want to make a shift now to our guests, our three speakers for the evening. There was such a tremendous amount of resonance across your presentations this evening. And I just wonder if anyone wants to jump in, if you felt or thought that as you heard one another.
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. One of the things that I really noticed in all three presentations was the importance of sort of identifying the role of ancestors. It also is, of course, in the MASA presentation as well. But I was just sort of curious because I think that we draw on those, we draw on the ancestors and the ideas of them in different ways. And I think Leroy, I felt like, was more embracing the ancestors, especially to the extent that they're inspiring your work. Mine is probably somewhat similar, whereas I felt like Anurima was kind of pushing back against a little bit, not maybe against ancestors, but against sort of a using, I don't know, using tradition as a mechanism for other gains, which sort of, I guess, draws on the past. So I was just sort of curious how you all thought about that, and if I don't know, if the same thing sort of struck you as we were talking.
Yeah, it really struck me that we all are, continuing the past and continuing that the past makes up at least part of who we are today. It's really powerful, very powerful. And I'm not saying that all ancestors have a positive story, because there's a lot of wrongs in this country and on this land that happened to our ancestors, but we can't not speak that too. That's part of the story, and I think that's how we learn in the future to not, we gotta learn what we've done. We tell children, learn from what we've done, but adults seem to don't do that, So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that observation. And I think part of it, the difference in terms of our approaches might be that some ideas of ancestors have been suppressed and marginalized, while others have been really elevated and celebrated. So when I was speaking of classical forms, they often tie so much to dominant groups who are elevating their own forms from the past, and the people associated with those forms who contributed to making them and who are then revered as the founders of a particular set of aesthetics and therefore national or community-based artifacts. So I think it depends on whether you're in a dominant position versus a minority position, because then ancestry means different things. And I'm also struck by the way in which art is often imagined as a way of resisting, whereas it can also be used to consolidate power. And that's why I'm interested in classicism as a form of actually taking power, claiming power, rather than looking at, the nuances of any society, which have a range of artistic practices that speak to many other histories than the single one that the classical tends to direct its attention towards. So I do think that there was a difference there. I also noticed an interesting topic or subject that was common to our themes, and that was about the importance of institutions. And in your presentation, Angela, you were talking about how different Native communities and nations have their own institutional practices of governance, and how that's important in terms of being able to implicitly, at least, I know you couldn't get to this point fully, but about enforcing treaties and developing other models of governance outside the colonial one that exists. And Leroy, you were also talking about the importance of having an institution where there could be some form of representation, some kind of place to keep a memory of identities that have been, again, subjugated. So I was curious if that was a salient point for the two of you as well.
And a third piece, or I don't know what number we're on, but I think another thing that you brought up, Anurima, is the way memory is political. And, I think that would be true in each of your cases, is to think about the way, not sort of Democrat Republican politics, but the organization of power is at work in memory all the time. Would you agree with that? I know we're all being very respectful to leave space in the time it takes to unmute.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that just on the institution, I agree with the institutional point as well. I mean, I think just kind of going back, I guess, to my original question, which maybe ties into some of the larger themes with regard to memory and ancestors and power. For me, and I'm curious if this is something that Leroy and Anurima experience as well, there's sort of an inward-facing perspective, and then there's an outward-facing perspective. So I'm curious, and Anurima, I guess this relates to your project in particular, if there's sort of an inward-facing moment where within the group of scholars and people who understand the history that you're talking about, there's a place for that critique, and whether you feel that there's an outward-facing moment where you're less critical, in the sense that, because you said at the end that there's also, I made a note, that dance is also a decolonial practice. So even though you recognize the extent to which it's been heavily influenced by colonization and sort of these tropes of classicism, at the same time, it also has survived as this incredible and beautiful form that is actually, maybe though influenced by the West, very distinct from the West. And it seems to me like still very much, there's still a there that's been preserved over all this time. And so I'm kind of curious about how the inward outward facing works. And I guess, Leroy, with your work as well, I feel like there's a place where there's sort of a way to be inwardly critical and provocative, whereas when we're kind of externally facing, we tend to be more, I guess, kind of, I don't know, more advocates in kind of in a less provocative way. I don't know if that resonates with either of you, but.
I think it's such a compelling point because there can be this internal discussion that's more complex sometimes because people who are involved in the practices themselves often understand the histories differently. So there is debate and discussion, and that may be too specialized or even not seen as relevant to a lot of communities outside, right? And as you were saying, that there is a kind of feeling sometimes that this needs to be protected, the sense of the classical, because it does offer that kind of substantive argument in opposition to the reign of Western canonical traditions, whether it's in dance or actually otherwise. We see the same debates in literature, right, about what constitutes classic or classical literatures and music and other kinds of practices. My interest is in more the label itself and how it didn't have any resonance in Indian indigenous traditions or philosophies. The practices existed, but the label did not. So why do we need this legitimizing label? And the reason why I don't see in this case that much of a need to differentiate the critique from within the community and the outward facing one is because the classical is a globally recognized lexicon. And so I think it has to be undone in the provincialized sense of the Indian classical, but more broadly speaking, just the classical imaginary in general, which did emanate from a Western English language framework. And so I think both of them have to be contested at the same time, which is why I don't think one can be done without the other. In fact, it strategically, from an artistic category perspective, wouldn't make sense to simply argue for the disposal of the Indian classical without noticing that it's the same problematic that the Western classical faces. So I would argue for a simultaneous critique of both.
Yeah, I think for me, the internal work needs to happen because you know, being Black and disabled, you know, outside, you just have to have your shit together because you're gonna be knocked down constantly. So that internal work that I think my mom put me in front of the TV, see and say it. But she knew that I needed to watch Porgy and Bess. You know, that was my internal work. You know, seeing my father's collection. If I didn't have that internal work, I would be brainwashed by institutions saying that, oh, you don't have no history, you know. Disabled people don't have no history because I bumped into that constantly, you know, outside of my home. So for me, that internal work needs to happen, and yeah, I mean, if it takes assistance, you know, from a more radical voice, because a lot of parents don't know, you know, my work, books, you know, so they have only the mainstream thinking. So sometimes that internal work needs to come with a person that knows that struggle. So, you know, he could have it there for, you know, young Leroy, you know. So young Leroy won't be brainwashed once they go into institutions or anywhere outside their home.
memory takes a long time, and we're a little short on time this evening. But I do want to, there's an important question here that's been raised in the Q&A that I want to just see if we can spend a moment with. And Angela, I know that you have to leave us in a moment. Other important things are asking for your attention, or maybe not things, people perhaps. But this is a question I'd like to just take a moment with. What do you think is the best way to keep a memory from being forgotten?
Well, I would say through stories. I mean, for me, that's such a huge part of my culture and my life, is to tell the story and to situate the story in the place. And I think that's a very Indigenous way of looking at the world. And I think that's what a lot of people, including a lot of my colleagues here at UCLA, and I thank you both also, for you and Anne-Marie, for having me here to discuss this, to really try to situate the Indigenous story in the place where we are and not stop telling it. And also, of course, tell it in concert with the people, the Tongva and other people of the area who still live here. And it's still their land and their place, and it's still where they're from. And I think really through that story is the most powerful way, in my opinion. And I didn't say thank you at the beginning, but thank you for having me here tonight.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time, this precious time, to be here with us, Angela. I think you might have, well, I'm going to let you slip away. How about that? Because there's a few more questions coming in from our audience. And while it won't feel complete to continue without you, I see a couple of questions that are percolating that I want to be able to address. So let's have a partial ending. We'll say thank you so much to you, Angela.
Yeah, Angela.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leroy, and thank you, Anurima. Nice to meet you. Sorry, I have to go.
I appreciate that all of us have, are taking your precious time to be here together. Here I have a question for Leroy. Anurima discussed the colonization of art forms of Indian dance and how we remember them. In your presentation, you touch on contributions of Black queerness in music. In fact, Black people, especially Black queer people, are the progenitors for so much of the popular music. Would you agree that the history of Black contribution to music has been erased by pop culture?
Not only pop culture, I'll go deeper. A lot of academics don't know, which blows my mind, that they don't know that Black disabled people really started the blues. To just be honest and be frank with you, Black blind people, were the foundations of the blues, and it just racks my brain to read a lot of Black scholars that I like that don't connect that history. It's like, what are you doing? It's almost impossible to write anything about early entertainment and not talk about Black blind blues artists, not talk about freak shows that were mostly disabled people of color. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's more than social media. It's just the way that the educational system is set up. We set up to be experts in one field, but if that field overlaps with different identities, then we're clueless. I can't tell you how many times I wrote Cornel West and Michael Dyson, all these Black scholars about Black disabled people, and they just don't know. So.
I was muted, sorry. Another question that came in is asking you both to think about the internet and social media and its impact on remembering today. That's a very big question. But if you'd like to jump in and share your thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
You go first.
Okay, I do think that the internet and social media have a huge role to play in terms of constructing particular forms of memory. So I feel like technology has transformed and accelerated and amplified and also actually trained our focus in the attention economy that we live in towards certain forms of artistic practice by certain bodies in particular. When I think of dance, I'm thinking of so many of the appropriative practices that occur in that sphere, and what Leroy, you were just saying about these histories that are suppressed and forgotten or simply neglected. I think we see some of those dynamics actually operating in social media as well. Just thinking of, in general, dance practices that when performed by popular bodies, by certain racialized bodies over others, or for example, there have been debates about how when very popular, iconic, for example, white social media influencers take dance practices that are associated with various marginalized groups, or in the US context, more specifically, continuing with that history of appropriating from Black culture, right? We do see in the social media context dance, popular dance, again, reviving these kinds of appropriative dynamics and monetizing them. And in the Indian classical dance context, if I just move to that place for a second, again, the social media space has a role in terms of amplifying certain aesthetic forms, yet now classical dances compete with popular dancing, social dance forms, again, commercial dance forms. So it's an interesting place where we see forms that have a great deal of social and cultural capital because of their association with a sense of heritage, civilizational pasts, meeting these contemporary dancing bodies, which are again being monetized, commodified in ways that then compete for that same space of cultural capital. I'm thinking of Bollywood dancing in particular. So it's just an interesting moment, how we see social media and the internet really actually for grounding, and people can actually engage in these debates, perhaps not in an in-depth way, but there is some currency about the debates that get magnified on social media and internet sources. So I think it's an interesting space for looking at the political effects of dance in relation to memory, in relation to what we want to project and keep, and what we want to forget.
Mm.
Yeah, you said it all. Said it all. Yeah, you know, social media is a mixed bag. Queer Pop Nation really, you know, blew up on social media. That's why we had chapters in Africa, and chapters in Brazil, because, you know, everybody is on social media. So that's a good thing. You know, of course, everything has a good and everything has a bad. The bad thing is that people don't do in-depth research. They just take what's on social media and just like, okay, boom. Like, for example, we talk about pop culture, you know, everybody was in love with Drake when Drake was playing the character of a student that got shot, and now he's a wheelchair user. He took that character to stage as Wheelchair Jimmy, and that just blew up, and people were just really like, what? You know, how can that blow up? And what we're doing in Queer Pop is doing the real stuff and we get no love. So that's the two sides of social media that that we have to deal with, when it comes to getting our work across. I found the story of The Dozens by KRS-One, a hip hop artist, on social media. I didn't know anybody named school, anybody in academic classes on it on YouTube by a 1980s hip hop artist. And he talked about how the Dozens were people with disabilities that were forced to entertain and forced to do, what we call rapping now, but there was the stories going back and forth. I was like, wow, I was like, okay, so hip hop, the ancestors of hip hop were Black disabled ancestors. I found that on social media. The guy, and I'm about to go for my PhD, but I found a part of my history on social media that there was never in books. That was never talked about. So, like everything else in the world, there's good sides and there's bad sides.
Just as things are heating up, unfortunately, we have to also draw this discussion to a close, but I do want to just cite a comment in the Q&A just about the amount of opposition, the amount of arguments over the truth about what stories get told, and the role the internet has in that, particularly, I think, motivated by finances, what makes money. And so the truth is becoming, a horribly movable feast. And I think that all the more reason that we need to continue to ask the question, how do we remember? And I think that each of you are memory disruptors in a way, and inviting us to challenge the stories that get told and making sure that we interrogate them, so to be able to imagine the future better. I want to thank you both for this evening, and in closing, I just want to thank you all for being here with us tonight to consider how do we remember. Students, you know what you're supposed to do next. Looking forward to reading your forum contributions. And this concludes this evening's program. We hope you'll join us again next week for How Do We Heal? Same time, new link. And to learn more about the entire series or to RSVP, visit arts.ucla.edu/10 questions. Thank you and good night.